They taped a violation notice on my porch swing the same morning Margaret set out the anniversary cornbread. Edward Thompson, 72, retired postman, still smells chimney smoke and old ink when he sits there, fingers brushing the porch journal she's kept since 75. Ever had a neighbor tell you nostalgia was against the rules? Edward adjusted the sagging cushion of his porch swing, the sun warming his knees as a familiar wind stirred the smell of marigolds and distant apple pie. The wooden swing creaked beneath him in a rhythm that felt like memory, slow, sure, and slightly out of tune. A folded fleece blanket lay nearby, unused but always ready, just like Margaret's reading glasses on the wicker table. He rocked gently as he watched Mr. Clay walk his dachshund down the sidewalk. Edward lifted his mug in greeting, steam curling from the rim. "Morning, Hal," he called out. Hal raised a hand. "Still hanging on to that swing, I see." Edward chuckled. "The day this swing goes, I go with it." From the other side of the porch, Margaret was kneeling beside a pot of golden mums. She snipped carefully with her gardening shears, humming a few bars of a jazz tune that hadn't been on the radio since '68. Her silver hair, tucked beneath a wide-brimmed straw hat, caught the light like a halo. "You know," she said, glancing up at him with a familiar spark, "if we repaint the swing cushions that shade of cranberry you like, it'll match the mums come November." Edward grinned. "Let's wait till they invent a paint that smells like cider and doesn't attract bees." She laughed, rising to dust off her knees. "Spoken like a man who never forgets the time you sat on a freshly varnished bench in '89. A gust of wind danced through the porch, jangling the little copper wind chime hanging from the eave. Margaret paused and closed her eyes. "Still sounds like vacation," she murmured. "Cape Cod, 1975, Edward replied, not missing a beat. "We bought it from that odd couple with the parrot and the saltwater fudge." They smiled together for a beat, wrapped in that kind of shared silence that only decades of marriage can produce. Then Margaret pulled a small bound notebook from the side table and jotted something quickly in her precise cursive. Edward knew better than to ask. Her porch journal was sacred, private reflections, weather notes, dreams she claimed not to remember. He settled back into the swing and pulled a small envelope from his cardigan pocket. Inside was a letter, hand-addressed, stamped, and scented faintly with lavender. He'd written it to their granddaughter, Lucy, who had just started college in Oregon. He still sent her letters every month. "Texting's fine," he'd told her, "but ink lasts longer than Wi-Fi." The porch, to Edward, was more than a space. It was legacy, 100 Sunday papers, 24 carved pumpkins, the backdrop of family reunions, sparklers, and the quiet sobs the night their eldest son left for his first deployment. Every nail in its frame had a story. Footsteps crunched along the walkway. Margaret's hands froze mid-trim. Edward's swing creaked to a halt. Around the side hedge, a beige figure emerged, upright, purposeful, clipboard clutched like a gavel. Karen Bellwood wore a sharply tailored blazer and kitten heels that clicked decisively against the concrete. Her lips were pursed in a way that suggested she had tasted something unpleasant and blamed someone else for it. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," she said, stopping precisely 3 feet from the porch steps. "Lovely weather." "Beautiful, isn't it?" Edward replied, voice even. Karen didn't respond. She flipped through the clipboard. "I'm afraid I need to bring something to your attention." Margaret stood, gloves still on. "We're listening." "There have been observations," Karen began, "regarding non-compliance with the updated Pinebrook aesthetic standards." Margaret raised an eyebrow. Edward leaned forward slightly. Karen cleared her throat. "Specifically, the fabric on your porch swing no longer aligns with the HOA-approved palette. The visible garden gnome near the steps violates ornamental limits, and the wind chime lacks registration." Edward blinked. "Registration?" Karen handed him a folded sheet. "The HOA requires all exterior elements be submitted and approved under the revised Outdoor Enhancement Policy, effective last quarter." Margaret stepped closer. "That swing has been here since 1981. That gnome belonged to my father." Karen gave a sympathetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. Sentimental items are charming, but guidelines exist for the harmony of the neighborhood. Failure to address these issues within 10 days may result in formal citations or a disciplinary hearing. Edward opened the sheet. The print was dense, bureaucratic, full of words like compliance, visual discord, and ordinance breach. He didn't reply. He simply stared at the paper while the wind fluttered the edge of his robe. Margaret, meanwhile, took the citation, folded it neatly, and slipped it into her apron pocket. Her expression was unreadable. Karen waited for acknowledgement, then gave a crisp nod and turned on her heel. As her footsteps receded, the wind chime stirred again, soft, metallic, a whisper of past summers. Margaret folded the citation and whispered, "She just poked the wrong beehive." The next morning, Edward found a yellow envelope wedged into the mailbox, no stamp, just urgent, HOA, scrawled in blocky letters. The handwriting was precise, heavy, and as joyless as Karen Bellwood's cardigans. He turned it over, half expecting it to hiss at him. Margaret, still in her robe, peeked through the screen door with a steaming cup of coffee. "Good news?" "Depends how you feel about extortion before breakfast," he muttered, stepping inside. The envelope crackled as he unfolded the letter. Margaret leaned over his shoulder as they read in silence. Notice of non-compliance, second and final warning. Failure to correct porch violations within 48 hours will result in a $250 fine and/or formal review by the HOA Visual Standards Committee. This includes, but is not limited to, swing upholstery, lawn ornaments, and unapproved sound-emitting decor. Margaret scoffed. Unapproved sound-emitting. That chime has better pitch than half the church choir. Edward pinched the bridge of his nose. "I spent 30 years walking mail through blizzards and fire ants, and now I'm getting fined by a lady with laminated authority." She set her coffee down and reached for her iPad. "I'm Googling Karen HOA fine templates. I want to see if she used clip art again." Edward chuckled in spite of himself. Later that morning, he shuffled back onto the porch, tugging his cardigan tighter against the rising wind. Across the street, a bright yellow sign caught his eye, "Lemonade, 50 cents, smiles free." A folding table stood proudly on the sidewalk. Behind it, a freckled boy with unruly hair was carefully arranging paper cups. A pitcher gleamed in the weak sunlight. "Morning, Mr. Thompson." Liam Carter called, grinning. Edward raised a hand. "What's the occasion, young man?" "Fundraiser," Liam said, adjusting his sign. "I'm saving up for a science fair robot. Also, Mom says I need to learn entrepreneurial grit." "Well, you picked the grittiest sidewalk in Pinebrook." Liam beamed. "Want one? It's got real lemons and a secret ingredient." Edward walked over, dropping 2 quarters into the tip jar. "Tell me it's not pickle juice." "Nope, mint." He took a sip. Tart and sweet, with a zing of fresh mint. "That'll wake the knees," Edward said, nodding approvingly. A few neighbors passed by with a smile. Even Mrs. Clay paused on her morning walk to compliment Liam's stand, remarking that it reminded her of the block parties back in '94. But before Edward could sit down with his cup, the temperature seemed to drop. Karen Bellwood appeared, as if conjured by the scent of defiance. Her heels clicked toward the stand. "Young man," she said, eyes narrowing, "do you have a permit for this operation?" Liam blinked. "I'm just selling lemonade." "For a robot." Karen shook her head. "Sidewalk commerce is not permitted under Pinebrook HOA regulations without pre-approval. You're in violation of subsection 14B. Edward stepped in, voice calm. "Karen, he's 12. "Rules are rules, Mr. Thompson," she said crisply. "This sets a precedent. What if others start selling baked goods, or, heaven forbid, used books?" Liam's lip quivered. "I didn't know I needed a permit." Karen handed him a printed notice from her clipboard. "You'll need to dismantle this immediately." Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out a $5 bill. "I'll take 2 more lemonades." Liam looked up, unsure, then poured carefully. Edward handed him the bill and added, keep the change. That's for grit. Karen gave him a disapproving glance. Encouraging rule-breaking isn't neighborly. Edward didn't reply. He just handed Liam a second cup and nodded toward the porch. Karen watched them in silence, then turned and strode off, her heels stabbing the pavement like punctuation marks. Later that day, a folded HOA newsletter arrived in their mailbox. Margaret scanned it and groaned. She added a new line, upcoming porch inspections to ensure community standards. She's escalating. Edward sat with the newsletter in one hand, the second warning letter in the other. His fingers drummed the table, slow and thoughtful. He glanced across the street. Liam was gone. Only the yellow sign remained, folded in half, resting on the table like a flag after a retreat. The wind chime rattled above them. Edward rose slowly, went inside, and returned with a thin black binder, one with the original HOA bylaws from the 1990s. The paper smelled of dust and ink and the kind of loopholes that only persistence could find. He opened it to the table of contents, his eyes scanning. Margaret looked up. "You're reading bylaws voluntarily?" "Just brushing up," he said. Her brow lifted. "On what?" Edward, eyes narrowed, looks at HOA bylaws and murmurs, "Time to dust off the old rules." Margaret held the faded deed of the old diner in her hand, smiling like someone who just found buried treasure. Her fingers brushed over the edges of the brittle paper, now soft with age, like a long-lost friend found beneath layers of forgotten years. "You were right," Jason said, grinning as he leaned back in the cracked vinyl chair of the Pinebrook archive office. It was still filed under Thompson's table, 1983 closure, voluntary surrender of kitchen license. Margaret tucked a loose curl behind her ear. "I remember cleaning out those spice racks, but I never thought we'd be back here, hunting legal loopholes." Grace, balancing a tablet and coffee in the crook of her elbow, scanned the license with a portable scanner. "Let me digitize this. If the HOA wants documentation, we'll give them a whole Dropbox folder." Edward, seated beside them with a thermos of cider, watched the screen flicker to life as their old diner's legacy transformed into digital defense. "This place fed half the neighborhood after ballgames and PTA meetings," he murmured. Grace smiled. "My dad still talks about your peach cobbler." Back at home, the porch was basked in late morning light. Maple leaves rustled across the floorboards as Edward studied an old photo from the diner, himself in a mailman uniform, laughing beside a counter stacked with mashed potatoes and meatloaf. "That porch," he said, pointing at the background of the photo, "was the after-dinner spot. Folks would bring lawn chairs and just sit. Talk. Let the night breathe." Margaret leaned over his shoulder. "Community. That's what we built. Not some checklist for shrub angles and swing fabrics." A soft knock at the porch railing pulled their attention. Mr. Patel stood there, holding a bundle of mail. "I believe this is yours, accidentally sorted into my box," he said, his tone cautious but kind. "Thank you, Ravi," Margaret said, stepping down with a warm smile. She reached behind the rocking chair and produced a foil-wrapped loaf. "Cornbread. Still warm. I made extra." He hesitated. "You didn't have to." "It's just bread," she said gently. "But it's also a truce. I heard what they did about your fence last summer." His eyes softened. "Then I accept." That afternoon, they drove out to the edge of Pinebrook, to where Thompson's table still stood. The building wore decades like a patchwork quilt, a crooked sign, dusty windows, closed, notice half peeled from the door. Edward slid the old key into the lock. It turned with effort and memory. Inside, motes of dust caught the light like confetti. The booths were still there, faded but upright. The counter had a crack running through the laminate, and a spider had claimed the napkin holder as home. But it was theirs. "I used to cut onions back there," Edward said, pointing toward the old kitchen. "Then walk straight here to hand a letter to Mrs. McKinley." Margaret pulled open a creaky cabinet and laughed. "The good dishes. You swore we'd never use them. And yet." They took their time, cleaning off a corner of the counter and sitting for a moment in the quiet. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was a rekindling. When they stepped outside, a familiar click of heels broke the spell. Karen Bellwood stood by the fence line, arms crossed, clipboard hugged to her chest like a badge of honor. "Well," she said, glancing at the boarded windows and faded paint, "I see Pinebrook's eyesores are expanding." Edward didn't rise to it. Margaret, however, gave a polite smile. "Some things age gracefully, Karen. You'd be surprised." Karen sniffed and walked away, muttering something about code violations waiting to happen. They watched her retreat until she turned the corner, and Margaret turned to Edward, eyes bright. "She wants modern, clean lines. HOA approved perfection." She brushed dust from her sleeves. "Let's give her heritage." That night, on the porch, the plan took root. Jason returned with scanned documents, and Grace began drafting a mock flyer on her tablet. Edward sifted through the HOA charter, eyes scanning each paragraph with the precision of a man who'd sorted mail by zip code for 3 decades. He stopped on a paragraph midway down. "Margaret," he said slowly, "listen to this, Section 3.2.3, community gatherings hosted on legacy business property are exempt from HOA location restrictions, provided there is no admission fee and the event is open to all residents." Margaret leaned over the binder, reading it twice. Then she looked up with a sly grin. "If they want modern, let's show them heritage they can't erase." A swing creaked softly in the morning breeze, but Edward's gaze was fixed not on the porch, but on a highlighted sentence in the HOA charter. He ran a finger along the brittle margin, murmuring the words aloud: "Decorative structures of historical or seasonal significance are permitted with neighborly consensus." He leaned back, poring over the rest of the scanned printout Jason had emailed the night before. The 1992 charter, preserved like an ancient artifact, had more loopholes than a fishnet. Edward, once a quiet observer of neighborhood rhythms, now read each paragraph like a general charting a counterstrike. Margaret brought out 2 mugs of chamomile tea, placing one beside the worn swing. "You've been at that since 6, she said, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Did you sleep at all?" "Just enough," Edward said, eyes still scanning. "Look at this clause on seasonal adornments. I think I found our first chess move." Down the street, laughter trickled from front lawns as children placed jack-o'-lanterns on stoops. A scarecrow leaned against the Carter's porch, its plaid shirt puffed with straw. Despite the chill, the neighborhood felt alive in a way Edward hadn't seen in years. Jason's garage door was half open when Edward arrived later that morning, a stack of annotated pages under his arm. Grace waved from inside, sorting extension cords for her Halloween light show. "Printing's done," Jason said, gesturing toward a tidy pile. "And I flagged 3 more clauses. Karen's going to need a lawyer." "Let's keep it neighborly," Edward grinned. "But thorough." Back at home, Margaret sat at the porch table with a fountain pen and her best stationery. Her handwriting flowed in gentle loops as she drafted a formal letter to the HOA, a request to reinstall their original porch swing fabric as part of a heritage holiday initiative. She added references to their anniversary, the town's history, and enclosed a sepia-toned photo of the porch from 1975. It was a masterpiece of polite subversion. That afternoon, Mr. Patel arrived with a folder tucked under his arm. "I heard what happened with Liam," he said quietly, handing Edward a copy of an old complaint form. "Karen tried the same thing with my bird bath last year. Claimed it was an attractant for vermin. I lost the appeal." Margaret brought out cornbread warm from the oven and invited him to sit. As they broke bread, Patel's weary frown softened. "I've lived here 23 years, he said. "I thought I was the only one getting tired of the rules changing every month." "You're not," Edward said, slicing another piece. "And I think it's time we remind them who built this neighborhood." By evening, the porch was alive with quiet energy. Grace and Jason stopped by to share copies of bylaws. Mrs. Clay brought a thermos of cider, her usual silence replaced by gentle commentary on past HOA absurdities. Even the Johnson twins lingered near the porch steps, listening wide-eyed as adults spoke in hushed tones about letters, fines, and heritage. Edward slipped their decorative petition into a manila envelope, sealed it with meticulous care, and walked it to the HOA mailbox at the community center. He passed 3 homes with new Halloween garlands. 2 had scarecrows modeled after Edward's old male uniform. He smiled, not sure if they were mocking or honoring, but he chose the latter. As he returned home, a fresh sheet of paper flapped on the porch rail. He peeled it off and read the new notice: all fall-themed decorations must receive written approval from HOA board, effective immediately. He looked up just in time to see Karen's beige Lexus glide past, its driver not even glancing his way. Margaret stepped beside him, her fingers curling around his arm. Margaret's cornbread filled the porch with warm scent, just as the first RSVP for the Heritage Porch Potluck slid under their door. The envelope, off-white and hand-addressed in gentle loops, carried a simple note: "We'll bring the sweet tea. Clay family." Edward picked it up with a grin. "Well," he said, waving the envelope at Margaret, "that's one confirmed rebel." She chuckled softly, taking the note to pin on the kitchen corkboard already crowded with hand-drawn invitations and a growing list of names scribbled in pencil. In the warm light of early evening, the porch had turned from battlefield to bakery, with Margaret in her apron and Liam perched at the wicker table, tongue sticking out slightly as he tried to perfect his calligraphy. "Don't press so hard," Margaret advised, her hand gently guiding his. "Letters are like people, they don't respond well to too much pressure." Liam giggled. "That's what Mom says about math homework." Edward, meanwhile, sat near the swing with a stack of crisp flyers on his lap. Heritage Porch Potluck, the headline read in typewriter font, complete with an image of their old diner logo Margaret had found in a shoebox. The invitation avoided digital tools completely. It was handcrafted, neighborly, and distinctly outside Karen's surveillance grid. They'd agreed to keep things informal but documented. Just compliant enough. Jason arrived just before sunset with a roll of masking tape and an amused expression. "Grace is at home sewing gingham napkins," he said. "We're apparently leaning into the theme." Edward handed him a bundle of flyers. "Mailbox only. No doorsteps, HOA Clause 12B. "Got it," Jason said, saluting. Under the amber light of street lamps, a quiet parade began. Mr. Patel passed out flyers near the cul-de-sac while Liam and Edward covered the south block. Grace took the west side with her niece, who'd brought along a basket of tiny pumpkin pins to attach for charm. Neighbors peeked out with cautious smiles, more curious than resistant. Back on the porch, Margaret stirred chili in a slow cooker while flipping through her porch journal. She paused at an old entry from 2004, June 18, lemonade with Danny after his graduation. He said, "I laugh like a train whistle." A wistful smile crossed her face before she slipped the book closed. From the sidewalk, Mrs. Clay approached slowly, her shawl tightly drawn against the breeze. Karen trailed behind her, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning every porch. Edward raised a hand. "Evening, Mrs. Clay." "Ms. Bellwood." Karen nodded curtly but said nothing. Mrs. Clay paused at the bottom step, then looked back at Karen and said, "Punishing a child for selling lemonade? That's where you crossed the line." Karen's eyes narrowed, but she remained silent. With a soft humph, she turned and walked off. Edward offered Mrs. Clay a chair, but she simply nodded and continued her slow stroll. Later that night, Edward opened his ancient Smith Corona typewriter, fed in a fresh sheet, and began pecking out thank you notes. Each one unique. "Thank you for your porch pride," one began. "Bring what you love, wear what you want," another read. They would deliver them by hand, the old way. Mr. Patel stopped by with a painted wooden sign. "Donated by Patel Printing," it read. "Heritage Porch Potluck, October 28, 5 p.m., all neighbors welcome." He rubbed the edge proudly. "First time this shop's printed anything not for HOA in 5 years. Feels good, doesn't it?" Edward said. From a second-story window across the street, Karen watched. The flicker of light behind her blinds cast her silhouette like a sentry. Just before turning in for the night, Margaret placed the final cornbread loaf into a gingham-lined basket. Edward tacked up the event sign beneath the porch light. A soft rustle at the door caught their attention. Edward opened it to find a printed HOA email on their welcome mat, bold red font underlined at the bottom. Any unregistered gathering may result in documented violation under Article 14. He handed it to Margaret. She read it, lips pursed, then passed it back. Edward folded the paper carefully, laid it beside the stack of RSVP notes, and said with a glint in his eye. The porch glowed with string lights, cornbread crumbs scattered like confetti, and laughter filled the yard. The old swing creaked gently under the weight of two veterans retelling stories no one had asked for but everyone stayed to hear. The scent of bacon-wrapped dates, kettle chili, and Margaret's signature corn pudding mingled in the crisp October air. Paper lanterns swayed between maple branches, casting golden halos across folding tables draped in faded linens. Mrs. Clay strummed her ukulele softly, coaxing out the chords to a tune long shelved but not forgotten. She glanced toward Liam, who beamed behind his resurrected lemonade stand. No prices, just a hand-lettered sign that read, "Fresh and free, just like front yards should be." Edward raised a steaming mug of cider and tapped it gently for attention. The quiet came easily. 50 years ago, he began, Margaret and I built this porch with borrowed tools and stubborn nails. We raised kids, buried dogs, and watched 4 generations of mailmen mess up the route. Laughter rippled. But through it all, this porch, this patch of wood and wind chimes, reminded us we belong here. Tonight, seeing all of you, I realize something. He paused, letting the moment settle. Tu do bat dao tu cheek porch. The cheer that followed was warm, unpolished, and real. Jason lifted his plate in salute. Mr. Patel passed out homemade samosas like precious relics. A retired piano teacher called for a song, and someone shouted, "Take me home, country roads." Without cue, voices joined, not all in tune, but all in. As the final chorus echoed, headlights cut across the street. A silver SUV rolled to a stop just beyond the edge of lantern glow. Karen sat behind the wheel, her face unreadable in the dashboard light. Clipboard in lap. A still figure in a moving night. The festivities continued, though a subtle hush pulsed beneath each conversation. Margaret approached Liam and adjusted the corner of his sign. "Smile like you're not afraid," she whispered. Karen emerged slowly. Heels clipped across pavement. She stopped near the table where deviled eggs sat beside homemade banana bread, folded her arms, and addressed Edward without pleasantries. This gathering lacks documented authorization under HOA Event Policy Section 3, Clause C. Edward, unfazed, reached into the cedar box beside him and pulled out 2 folded papers. One was the HOA Charter from 1992, the other, a reply from HOA legal counsel confirming neighbor-led seasonal events on private property with less than 30 attendees were exempt from advance filing. He handed them over without a word. Karen scanned both, her fingers trembling slightly. Her gaze darted across the porch, counting heads. Jason stepped forward with a pie, offering a slice wordlessly. She declined. Her jaw tightened. "Expect a formal response," she said, voice clipped. She turned on her heel, returned to her car, and disappeared into the night. A long exhale moved through the crowd like wind through trees. Grace whispered something to her aunt. Mr. Patel clapped Liam's shoulder and murmured, "Well done, Captain." Edward sat again beside Margaret, the old porch groaning softly beneath them. Across the yard, children danced under lantern light. Someone placed a record on an old turntable. The melody was low, swaying, just right. The community center was silent, except for the creak of the old podium, and Karen's heels clicking across the floor. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as a soft shuffle of folding chairs echoed through the wooden-paneled hall. Edward sat near the back, Margaret by his side, her hand resting lightly on his knee. Liam squirmed beside Mrs. Clay, trying to stay still in the too-big chair. Karen cleared her throat. "I hereby call this emergency meeting of the Pinebrook Homeowners Association to order." Her voice rang sharp against the hush. She began briskly, projecting authority. Effective immediately, the HOA will implement 12 new ordinances, measures meant to preserve community aesthetics and public safety. She clicked her remote. A slideshow blinked to life behind her, bulleted points about uniform mailbox colors, pet leash lengths, seasonal decor limits, and a ban on public food stands without permit. Edward raised his hand. Karen hesitated, her lips twitching. "Yes, Mr. Thompson." He stood slowly, pulling a folded packet from his jacket. "Before we talk about adding new rules," he said, voice even, "perhaps we ought to revisit the ones we already have." Karen's smile faltered. Edward stepped to the front, unfolding yellowed pages, the original 1992 HOA charter. This document, binding and still in effect, states that no policy shall infringe upon historically grounded, non-commercial neighborhood gatherings. He laid the page flat on the podium. That includes porches, potlucks, and yes, lemonade stands. Jason dimmed the lights, clicking his laptop. A grainy slideshow appeared, Liam behind a folding table grinning with a pitcher. Margaret's wind chime dancing in the autumn breeze. A note on the bulletin board reading, "Potluck tonight, neighbors only." Next, a slide of an HOA notice, "Fines applied for non-compliant decorations." Then another, a photo of a flag being removed from Mr. Patel's porch. Jason spoke calmly, "Over the last 6 months, these letters have quietly multiplied. Families fined for wind socks, for chimes, for patriotic bunting. My wife Grace was told her sidewalk chalk mural wasn't aesthetically consistent." A low murmur rose through the room. Karen shifted in her chair, eyes narrowing. Margaret stood next. 40 years ago, Edward built our porch swing with his father," she said softly. 2 weeks ago, we were told it was visually obsolete." She held up the citation. "But I keep a journal on that swing. I watched our grandkids take their first steps off that porch. You cannot fine away history." Mr. Patel raised a hand. "Last winter, my daughter was told her wreath was religiously ambiguous." He paused. "I didn't move to America for silence." From the back, a quiet voice spoke up. It was Mr. Albert, white-haired, stooped, long believed to be Karen's quiet supporter. "I voted for these rules back in '92, he said. "But I'll tell you what, I just want the boy to sell his lemonade in peace." A pause. Then a woman stood, then another. A man in plaid raised his hand. Edward turned to Karen. "We, the residents, respectfully motion for a vote of confidence in the current HOA leadership." Karen froze. Jason stepped forward, raising a printed petition. "We gathered 23 signatures in the past 48 hours. That exceeds the minimum to trigger a leadership review." Karen tried to speak, but her voice caught. One by one, hands went up, calloused, wrinkled, some trembling, but steady. For the first time in a decade, the Pinebrook HOA meeting was more than a monologue. It was a reckoning. Sunlight hit the front porch just right, and Margaret laid out the cornbread like it was Sunday morning in 1975. The breeze carried the scent of cinnamon and leaves, and the porch swing creaked gently with each push of Edward's foot. His favorite coffee mug, faded with age, sat beside him, half full. Margaret placed a bowl of apple butter next to the bread and tucked a napkin under the edge so it wouldn't fly away. Down the street, Liam's lemonade sign leaned slightly to the left but still read strong in bright green marker, "Fresh lemonade, free for friends." He stood proudly beside it, grinning, as Mrs. Clay handed him a mason jar of pickled peaches for his help setting up chairs earlier. A letter had arrived 2 days prior. No fanfare, just a typed line at the bottom: "Karen Bellwood resigns from Pinebrook HOA leadership, citing personal matters." No one asked further. No one needed to. The new HOA board, 3 soft-spoken neighbors with easy smiles and 0 clipboards, made their presence felt not through rules but by showing up. They helped hang string lights at the square, distributed hot cocoa during Liam's stand, and nodded gently when someone mentioned reviving porch concerts. Change came not in loud speeches but in shared casseroles and open invitations. Margaret's flyer for the porch brunch had been written by hand, photocopied at Mr. Patel's print shop, and delivered door-to-door with Liam's help. It read, "No registration. No RSVPs, bring food. Bring stories. Bring your porch spirit." By 10 that morning, folding chairs filled the Thompson yard and spilled onto the sidewalk. Pies, slow cookers, and baskets of biscuits appeared like magic. Mrs. Clay played her ukulele quietly as neighbors passed casseroles and swapped old photographs. A retired mechanic tuned a weathered guitar. Grace passed around printed snapshots Jason had pulled from their new Pinebrook Memories website, photos of porches lit by sunset, kids in Halloween costumes, Margaret's journal resting atop an armrest. Edward stood quietly at the edge of the porch, taking it all in. Margaret moved beside him, holding a wooden plaque freshly polished. Without ceremony, she hung it on the fence post at the front of the yard. Thompson's Table, EST 1973. The crowd, mid-conversation and mid-chew, paused for just a moment. Then someone clapped. Then more. Not loud applause, just enough to honor what the sign meant. It wasn't a rebellion. It was a homecoming. Margaret smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. 50 years, she whispered to Edward. And this brunch might just be my favorite one. He squeezed her hand. You always said food brings folks home. Jason wandered by with Liam on his heels, both holding lemonades. Grace wants to put up a photo wall on the site, Jason said. Maybe something called Porch Life. I figured, we could start with yours. Margaret laughed. Only if you use the ones where Edward's wearing that ridiculous fishing hat. The sun climbed higher, cutting through the fading gold of fall. Steam rose from mugs, conversations meandered from cookbooks to grandkids, and laughter rolled down the block like an old tune remembered. From her folding chair, Mrs. Clay looked over the scene with a knowing smile. She sipped her cider, leaned toward Margaret, and whispered, "Porches win wars, honey." Margaret didn't answer. She just looked around, at the swing, the bread, the neighbors, the light, and knew they had won something better than a battle. They had taken back their home. The porch stood quiet again, bathed in the soft light of a Sunday morning, but this time it carried the echoes of something more than memories. It held the weight of a community rekindled. What began as one man's silent resistance became a shared stand against silence itself. When power overreaches, it's not always noise that stops it, but steady, decent people choosing to stand side by side. Like a well-worn porch swing still holding strong, quiet unity can outlast even the loudest rules. And perhaps, in the end, it's not about winning the fight, but remembering who your neighbors really are.